In 2016, Leslie was instrumental in founding the Compass project, which provides routes into university for people in the asylum process. And she continues to chair the Compass Steering Committee to ensure that Birkbeck offers a welcoming and supportive environment to students who face barriers, including legal and physical geographical barriers, to access higher education. A lecture tonight is connected to these insights into asylum seeking and asylum offering. And I'm highlighting this as a good demonstration of the range and relevance of her research. She has published widely on topics ranging from freedom and the cage, modern architecture and psychiatry in Central Europe, 1890 to 1914, the monograph she published in 2017, to architecture and truth in Fin de siècle, Vienna, published in 2004. I mentioned two, but there are many. Look them up on her website. Her shorter essays have been included in many edited collections and academic journals on the history of architecture, yes, but also on the history of medicine, of anti-Semitism, of Central Europe, and of art, of course. She has recently won a Leverhulme International Fellowship, enabling her to focus on a new project, which is titled Disrupted Lives, a new reading of Spaces of Confinement. And she will be working on this in 2021-22 as a visiting professor at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Leslie, thank you very much for being with us tonight to talk about your work on the spaces we are reduced to. Over.
Thank you so much, Patrizia, for the warm welcome and warm introduction. And I want to extend my welcome to everyone here. What wonderful list of people, many familiar names in the list. So thank you everyone from joining from all over the place, wherever you are. I will share my slides. Great, okay. If we could start, in fact, with the first slide, the next one after this. Thank you. The Oxford English Dictionary defines lockdown as the confinement of prisoners to their cells for an extended period of time, usually as a security measure following a disturbance. And they point out this is also applicable to the context of a psychiatric hospital or other secure unit. Next slide, please. We've slipped easily into using this carceral term for the periods of the severest restrictions in many countries during the COVID-19 pandemic. It's a compelling metaphor. The world became not only a prison, but a prison in a state of emergency, in lockdown. We were stuck inside, reduced to the spaces in which we normally spent only a fraction of our lives. When we're not out mixing in the world, we live and sleep somewhere, mostly in a more or less self-contained unit, a house, a flat, a room. And that's where, except when attending to the bare necessities, most of us had to stay put. Next slide, please. Many of us, like the men confined to the Pentonville Penitentiary in the middle of the 19th century, worked in our cells. The key workers who continued to move between home spaces and workspaces were like the prison staff, manning the kitchens, maintaining the infrastructure, delivering essentials to the cells, patrolling the corridors, and staffing a very busy infirmary, and sadly, a mortuary. Next slide, please. But this world as prison metaphor breaks down when we think about how prisons like Pentonville were designed to impose a grim form of equality on their inmates, a kind of leveling down. This equality is expressed and instantiated spatially in the cellular structure. All the cells are the same size, as you can see in this floor plan. All the prisoners live in the same conditions. The pandemic lockdowns, on the other hand, have taken place in a highly unequal world. And that inequality manifests itself in the spaces we live in our relationship to them, and the extent to which we have control over them. Next slide, please. Do we own our own home? Is our home secure, or could we be evicted? Does our home represent an asset that provides a bedrock of stability and security, not only for ourselves, but for our descendants? Or is our home a necessity we can barely afford and that could be removed at any time? Next slide, please. Or do we in fact already live in an institution? A prison, a secure mental health unit, a care home, a children's home, an immigration detention center, like the one here in the slide. A space in which our personal space, insofar as we have any, is in the gift of the authority running the institution. Related to these questions of ownership and stability is the extent of control we have over the spaces we live in. Do we share common spaces, and if so, with whom? Nuclear family, extended family, friends, strangers? Do we have a space we can call our own, a room of our own to which we control access? It's worth asking as well whether this we, this first person plural, is really tenable in this context. There's been a lot of the use of the pronoun we during the pandemic, which on the one hand expresses a revived sense of solidarity that gives reason for hope, but on the other hand, it elides pronounced differences in experience between me, for instance, a newly minted and well-paid professor in my role today commanding your attention, and someone whose economic and social position, whose housing situation lacks the security and pockets of quiet which underpin this kind of performance. Next slide. The living space, the type of domestic architecture that we see in the Anglo-American world as constituting both the norm and the ideal, is the owner-occupied single-family home with an attached garden. And I show you an example of a semi-detached house from the Victorian period. This kind of home offers spatial control with its fences, party walls, and separate entrances. Any leakage into other people's living spaces is prevented. This is about the privilege of privacy, but what I want to focus on is something slightly different that's been highlighted by the lockdown, but not, as far as I know, articulated. And that is spatial variety and its opposite, spatial reduction. But you might say, isn't spatial variety what it is that we've lost? Hasn't this been replaced by a kind of monotony of space? And I think what I want to show and talk about is how that is the case much more for some people than for others, that we've had very different levels of access to spatial variety within our homes. Next slide. The owner-occupied single-family home with attached garden, when occupied by a family or at least occupied by more than one person, has within it the possibility of solitude on the one hand and community on the other, and crucially of a choice between these, even when the spatial options beyond the front door aren't there anymore or not in the same way. When we look at the single-family house now, we can see spaces for, and I've shown you an example here from Rightmove, we can see spaces for gathering together and for separation, and how these have in fact been kind of exaggerated in both directions in recent years, with an open plan downstairs and the multiplication of individual rooms upstairs, often with loft conversions multiplying those rooms, and multiplied bathrooms as well. And then the conversion of the garden into further rooms for togetherness and solitude, not forgetting the shed or the garden office at the end of the garden. Next slide, please. We've heard about writers having a good lockdown. And normally this is put down to writers being used to their own company and being able to get on with their work. But maybe it's also because the writers who get asked about their lockdown experiences in the media tend to be financially secure and successful, to have the infrastructure of spatial variety securely in place around them within the curtilage of their home. One can imagine other writers, thinkers, researchers, bloggers, who are also happy to spend long hours in solitary work, but without the armature of those spaces. They normally fill the libraries and cafes, seeking solitude, time apart from family, housemates, even roommates, time to concentrate and think. They seek at least an approximation of that solitude, often with the aid of noise-blocking headphones in public and semi-public spaces. Next slide, please. Birkbeck students serve as good examples here, since the Birkbeck student body has a very wide range of ages, life situations, and incomes. With teaching going online back last March, a lot of our students, and especially perhaps those who lived alone, really missed the companionship of other students and being together in the classroom with their tutors. But in the deepest part of lockdown, when the library was closed for a time to students, the people who missed it the most were the students sharing rooms with siblings or small homes with small children at home with the schools closed, or in the case of some of our forced migrant students that Patrizia referred to in her introduction, they were housed in actual dormitory accommodation by the Home Office. Their very ability to concentrate and learn, to revise, to write and complete assessments was undermined by the lack of access to solitary or semi-solitary space when they needed it. Though I would acknowledge that the Birkbeck library staff did heroic things, keeping the library open as much as they possibly could, and letting students come in and book spaces, which showed really how essential the use of those spaces was. Next slide, please. The lockdown has highlighted the extent to which the most privileged people have secured for themselves a private world of spatial variety, while the least privileged need pockets of private space in the public or semi-public realm in order to have any chance of approximating such variety, with its associated benefits of a sense of individual identity and personal development, including very concrete things like completing a course or gaining a qualification. Over the course of the last year, I have been spending my working hours ensconced in my office within my single-family semi-detached home, thinking about my research on the ways institutions of confinement were designed in the 19th century. I've been thinking about what the people responsible for those designs thought they were doing, how over time the spaces were used and changed, and what we might be able to glean about how they were experienced by the people confined there. This work has sensitized me to the aspects of our pandemic spaces that I've just described. Conversely, doing this research and thinking in the middle of lockdown has sensitized me to an aspect of the design of those 19th century institutional spaces that I'd never properly focused on before, but which I now see as of central importance. And that is that when these institutions were specifically designed for populations who were poor, as the institutions almost always were, a poverty of space was designed in. The spatial variety and autonomy which was secured by the affluent through the housing they had access to, and which was striven for by everyone else, was already restricted by the fact that people were confined within the bounds of the institution, cut off from their accustomed neighborhoods and networks. But it was also reduced or eliminated on the smallest and most intimate scales as well, in the way that institutional interiors were laid out and people were distributed within them. Next slide, please. We're used to thinking about the spaces of prisons and other institutions of confinement as designed in a very calculated way to be oppressive, thanks to Michel Foucault's highly influential texts from the 1960s and 70s. In my view, Foucault's analysis of the way space, surveillance, and regimes of behavior interacted to create disciplinary machines is still compelling and largely valid. But there are a couple of ways in which I want to further expand on elements of the analysis. I'm looking at how the confining institutions of the 19th century are designed specifically for poor people and informed by a set of images and understandings of what kind of space is appropriate for poor people. It's tempting to accept the rhetoric of the institution's designers, who are not just the architects, but also the officials, politicians, experts involved. Their rhetoric that the poor inhabitants of the institutions, plucked out of their hovels and slums, with quotation marks around them, they would, once transplanted into the institution, experience space in a completely new way, a transformative, reformative, curative way. That's the rhetoric. But I'd argue that we should ask whether, in fact, the poverty of the people confined there was used to justify the incorporation of aspects of the hovel and the slum into the spaces of the institution. Next slide, please. Here I've found really fruitful reading scholars in critical prison studies who are discussing current institutions and their operation. especially in the context of mass incarceration of racialized people in North America, and including first-person accounts from people who've been incarcerated, such as the article I'm showing you here by Michael Walker, a sociologist who spent a period as an inmate in a Southern California jail and based his findings on his observations. These studies take as their starting point the assumption that inequality is baked into the prison system. I'd argue that this isn't a later perversion, but was really there from the beginning. That inequality was manifested as a spatial reduction in the design of institutional spaces as well as in their use, and extended beyond the prison into other institutions, taking different forms along the way. I also want to show how voices were raised to challenge spatial reduction at the time. And indeed, I would say it's by attending to those voices that we can see what an important impulse it was, the spatial reduction, but also how it wasn't inevitable. Next slide, please. In mid-19th century Britain, two types of overtly punitive carceral institutions existed. There was the solitary system penitentiary, such as Pentonville, and the workhouse. Both incarcerated people within the bounds of the institution and cut off their access to public space. They fixed people in space and stopped them from wandering. They both also reduced spatial options for inmates at a finer grained level as well. They removed their autonomous access to different kinds of spaces and the ability to establish their own rhythm of solitude and company, life by themselves and life with others. They narrowed a person's experience of themselves and others down to one kind, over which they had almost no control. But the two types of institutions had completely different interior architectures, different ways of containing their inmates spatially. Solitary confinement prisons, could I have the next slide, please? Solitary confinement prisons confined people almost all the time to cells alone, while removing any protective privacy-providing features of those solitary spaces and undermining any comfort that might be experienced there. In workhouses, there was a punitive approach taken to poverty, specifically. Family units were taken apart and replaced with single-sex dormitories. The inmates of the workhouse were not reduced to eternal solitude in a cell, but rather to eternal togetherness, with no space for time apart. The penitentiary and the workhouse created a reduction, a poverty of spatial experience, and a loss of control over space for the poorest members of society. And this was the flip side, the inverted mirror image of the experience the affluent had of the houses they owned and lived in, with their rich variety of private and communal spaces. Next slide, please. The third main form of institution of confinement, asylums for the insane, had an ambiguous status. People were confined there involuntarily, often for long periods of time, their lives reduced to the space within the boundaries of the institution. But these institutions were not meant to be punitive. Instead, they were meant to be caring, curative, as well as secure. There was no inherent reason that they should cater in large part for the poor, but in Britain, the great majority of large state-built asylums did. The people they confined were paupers, people without means. I'm now going to speak about a campaign that occurred in the 1840s to afford pauper asylum patients a measure of spatial variety and therefore a measure of autonomy during their confinement in the institution. The campaign ultimately failed, but the fact that it happened is worth giving an account of, since it demonstrates that there was nothing inevitable about a starkly reduced spatial experience for the institutionalized poor. The existence of the campaign and its failure show that decisions were made to reduce the spatial options of day-to-day life in the full knowledge that there was another way of allowing people to live within the asylum. Next slide, please. Thank you, just getting the sun out of my eyes. The campaigner in question was John Connolly, a familiar figure to students of the history of psychiatry. Having been celebrated in standard psychiatric histories as a great liberating figure for leading the non-restraint movement, he was cast by Andrew Scull's revisionist account from 1989 as a consummate careerist and self-mythologizer. I would argue that it's time to look anew at Connolly as someone who, in the 1840s, was working within the system to shake it up, to draw abuses to people's attention, and to try, however haltingly, to eradicate them, even when these efforts made him, for a time, deeply unpopular. He was sensitized to the injustices and deprivations experienced by the poor people who made up the bulk of his patients, and at times adopted a tone of solidarity when writing about them in his treatises, articles, and letters, which is absent from the other texts by 19th century European psychiatrists. He was at times an advocate for people whose mental illness combined with their poverty left them doubly silenced. And I think in the Birkbeck context, it's worth mentioning that Connolly was an ally of George Birkbeck and mixed in the same kind of progressive circles, gave lectures at mechanics institutes on a regular basis, apparently. I have to admit to feeling a bit of a touch of vertigo as I go out on a limb by writing about Connolly in this way. I could and I perhaps should put in lots of provisos about the extent of his participation in a deeply problematic system. But for now, I'll simply refer you to Scull's account and to the work of Akihito Suzuki demystifying the non-restraint system, the main kind of innovation that Connolly was associated with. And also, I could refer you to my own article on the involuntary confinement of agitated patients in a room alone, the practice of seclusion, for which Connolly was also a vocal advocate. What I'm interested in here, though, is another campaign carried on by Connolly, in which he threw his weight behind the idea of the pauper lunatic asylum as a home that would preserve some of the spatial variety eradicated by other carceral institutions. Next slide, please. In 1839, Connolly was appointed the superintendent of the Hanwell Asylum, which had been built 8 years earlier by the then county of Middlesex. So this is on the outskirts of London. Hanwell was no model institution. It was described by one commentator as, quote, a vast straggling building in which the characteristics of a prison, a self-advertising charitable institution, and some ambitious pieces of poor law architecture struggle for prominence. Next slide, please. Connolly wasn't involved in its design, and he would have done several things differently if he had been, but he did value the way its basic spatial units were arranged. Like many asylums of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Hanwell Asylum was built according to the formula first used by Robert Hooke in his 17th century building for the Bethlehem Asylum. Its main wings consisted of small rooms along one side of a wide corridor or gallery, which served as a social space. The rooms were where the patients slept, obviously, and those rooms were a combination, in fact, of single rooms and small shared dormitories. Connolly reported that half of the patients in Hanwell slept in single rooms and half in dormitories. And so, whereas this plan looks like it consists entirely of very small spaces off the corridors, some of those are in fact bigger and would have been small dormitories. And I think there must have been more in the building as it was in fact used, more dormitories. While some patients would have spent significant amounts of time forcibly confined to their bedrooms or even to padded cells, the regime at Hanwell shouldn't be confused with the regime of a solitary system penitentiary like Pentonville. During the day, most of the patients were out of their rooms most of the time, but Connolly does seem to have seen the single room not only as a potential secure container, but also as a bolt hole, a space that the patient could retreat to and call their own, as well as a space for peaceful sleep. Next slide, please. There aren't any photographs or other images of the interiors of the single rooms at Hanwell. And in fact, in general, it's very hard to find images of the interiors of these single rooms. So I'm showing you here one from a Canadian example, one of the institutions I'll be looking at when I'm over in Kingston, Ontario. But it gives you a sense of how the room might be decorated and equipped to provide that sense of privacy and of something approximating the bedroom in a home, or possibly a hotel. Okay, next slide, please. The Metropolitan Commissioners of Lunacy was the high-powered inspection body for asylums, directed by the influential reformer Lord Shaftesbury. Their 1844 report was aimed at the many county officials and medics then devising schemes for new county asylums for pauper patients. Next slide, please. The report zeroed in on single rooms, or cells, as the authors called them, deliberately reviving an unfashionable term. They saw the predominance of single rooms as the mark of an old-fashioned institution, the generous provision of them for patients as an expendable extra. Dormitories, they argued, were less expensive and easier to ventilate. But knowing that those reasons were not in themselves enough for what was, after all, not supposed to be a punitive workhouse, but a curative sanctuary, they pointed to the needs and expectations as they saw them of the pauper patients. Next slide, please. Dormitories, they wrote, quote, better accord with the pauper's previous habits than sleeping alone in a solitary cell with a single window. Next slide, please. What were these previous habits then? The commissioners were presumably referring to the fact that was often discussed by social commentators and reformers, that the so-called lower classes in mid-19th century Britain, as in many other places in Europe, lived in overcrowded lodgings, with large families or more than one family sharing single rooms. Single people, for instance, seasonal workers or domestic servants, sometimes had to resort to sharing common rooms in lodging houses with strangers. It was true that sleeping alone in a room would have been an unfamiliar experience for many poor people, just as it became more and more the norm for single people and older children among the middle classes. The knowledge that to be poor in Britain meant living in crowded housing and sleeping in the same rooms as multiple others was for most commentators evidence of a crisis, of the great housing problem, something to be bemoaned, whether on humanitarian or more often on moral and medical grounds. And this illustration is from one of these kind of reforming books that's illustrating it, not just to record it, but to bemoan it. Next slide, please. Model houses were designed for workers' families, and these houses carefully separated the sleeping spaces for the parents and for the children of each sex. You can see them in B, C, and D there. Here, though, in the commissioner's report in 1844, though, we see this knowledge about overcrowding being used as a justification for not providing separate spaces for sleeping and for explicitly deciding that in a long-term residential institution, common dormitories were the way to go. Next slide, please. The commissioners' turn to the dormitory in their 1844 report seems to have galvanized Connolly to have galvanized him to articulate the importance of the generous provision of single rooms. In his often reprinted and translated treatise on the construction and government of lunatic asylums, Connolly pushed for more rather than fewer single rooms than were normally found in asylums. In all asylums, he writes, that the proportion of single bedrooms appears to me to be too small, and I always recommend to architects to have rooms for at least 2/3 of the number of patients to be received into any proposed asylum. Next slide, please. Like the commissioners, Connolly connected patients' living conditions outside the asylum with those they experienced within, but he took something completely different out of that connection. He wrote, "A clean and cheerful sleeping room, clean bedding, and a little coir matting on the stone floor are appreciated by the patient and help to reconcile him to the house. We possess, indeed, in county asylums this advantage, that our simplest accommodations constitute comforts rather above those enjoyed by the greater number of our poor patients in their sane state." Next slide, please. In this treatise and in other texts from the 1840s, Connolly also gave voice to the desires of patients expressed to him on his rounds. Any asylum doctor, he wrote, who, quote, "takes an interest in patients and converses daily with them, will recognize that, quote, no anxiety is so general, no petition so frequent, no longing so constant as for the privilege of having a bedroom to themselves, to work in, to read in, to be quiet in, to say their prayers in without interruption. No complaint is so constantly on their lips as that which arises from their not having a single room, and consequently not having a single moment to themselves or any place where they can be quiet." The absence of the single room is equated by the patients petitioning Connolly with the absence of a sense of self. The room offers a space apart from the congregate life of the institution, a space where, when not spending time in the galleries or engaging in the many work and leisure activities patients were expected to take part in, a person could have a moment to themselves. The Commissioner's report dealt with the question of single rooms versus dormitories as a unifunctional one. Where would the activity of sleeping take place? But these patients knew better. Before they were institutionalized, they may have slept crowded together with others, but they could find moments to themselves in the nooks and crannies of their wider environment: the quiet, empty churches, the corner of a pub, the park bench, their lodgings when the rest of its occupants were out. Confined in an institution with those spaces out of bounds, a single bedroom was an enclave not just for sleep, but for work, rest, prayer, reading, and staring out of the window. Presumably also for grooming, dressing, and other things that weren't so obviously virtuous or respectable, and thus not part of Connolly's polemics. To have access to a room of one's own meant spatial variety, the possibility of choice between solitude and togetherness. A room of one's own within the institution could also represent an enclave within which a person could house, protect, and arrange the objects that were important to them and engage in self-expression. Connolly recognized this as well. The single room, quote, becomes a kind of house to the patient. They attend to it themselves. They decorate it. Next slide, please. There's evidence of a patient in the Hanwell Asylum claiming ownership of his room in this way. In 1843, reporters from the Illustrated London News visited Hanwell and encountered a patient there called William Rayner, who apparently is one of the three dancing figures in the center of the image on the right. They were shown his room, and they reported, "His chamber is a perfect bijou. The walls are nearly covered with colored prints, and around on shelves are stuffed birds, shells, and knickknacks, set out with extraordinary regularity, the disturbance of which would greatly irritate the owner." Next slide, please. The notion of a series of rooms occupied by individuals giving onto a common space, with each room in some sense belonging to and enclosing the privacy and individuality of its occupant, evokes another kind of architectural arrangement for the poor, not the prison or the workhouse, but the almshouse. I'm not claiming that the kind of humane and ethical social framework for individual dignity and agency, which Peg Rawes sees as embodied in the almshouse model, could possibly be replicated inside a carceral institution like an asylum. But perhaps there is some approximation to that balance that you find in the almshouse. Next slide, please. In the end, Connolly's campaign failed, and his and his patients' pleas for the wide provision of single rooms in the pauper asylum went unheeded. Asylum spaces built in Britain and on the continent in the second half of the 19th century and into the 20th offered two types of spatial experience: constant isolation, on the one hand, or life always in the company of others on the other. The most agitated and potentially violent patients were isolated in secure cells and peripheral wings. For the rest, sleep happened in a group in dormitories. The bed itself and the space around it, perhaps a single chair and a box or a bag for personal effects, was what remained of the space apart. Next slide, please. In North America, asylum designers provided the majority of patients with single rooms for much longer, but by the late 19th century, this changed there as well. Irving Goffman's famous 1961 study of the asylum as total institution was based on a year of observing life in the St. Elizabeth's Mental Hospital in Washington, D.C. He reported that patients resorted to draping blankets over themselves to secure, however briefly and ineffectively, a break from what he referred to as batched living. The idea that the great majority of patients shared large dormitories was so much taken for granted by then that Goffman didn't even single that out for mention. Now coming to the end now and returning to the 21st century, where are people still living and sleeping in enforced and unbroken togetherness in Britain in the 21st century? Next slide, please. A combination of extortionate rents, low pay, discrimination, and the shortage of social housing means that there is a great deal of room sharing in privately rented housing. We've heard about this from public health officials who identify it as a reason for high coronavirus transmission rates in areas where many poor and especially poor ethnic minority people live. Our public residential institutions in the UK still mirror this kind of spatial reduction. Next slide, please. In residential mental health facilities, the standard is now the single room, but overcrowding in prisons, where of course many people with severe mental health problems do end up, overcrowding in prisons means that for most prisoners, the endless isolation of the solitary system prison has been replaced by endless togetherness with a cellmate, including in Pentonville prison, which is still open for business, and which because of overcrowding and now because of COVID is in a state of lockdown most of the time. In the Immigration Detention Center too, a new custom-built structure for confining people who get labeled illegal but who have not committed any crime. Rooms are designed to be shared. Next slide, please. The term asylum, meaning sanctuary, safety, and welcome, is an ancient and noble one. But it has a long modern history of being twisted and undermined by the societies claiming to offer it, so that the word itself, when attached to its recipients, still carries the stigma of the ostracized outsider. That was true of the asylum patient, and it's now true of the asylum seeker. The UK Home Office was defeated in the High Court last week in a case brought by 6 men who, after a dangerous channel crossing brought them to England, claimed asylum. They were then housed in ex-military buildings on a base near Folkestone in Kent, with over 200 other people in the same position. The buildings are barracks built in the 1890s for another population for whom batched living was the norm, the lowest ranks of soldiers. The Home Office, while they were devising a set of radically punitive changes to the asylum system, which will probably become law this year, chose during the COVID pandemic to house people in 12-person dormitories within these barrack buildings, which these extremely run-down barrack buildings, as you can see. Almost 200 people contracted the virus, the COVID-19 in these conditions. The High Court has ruled this appalling act unlawful, but the Home Office has yet to announce plans to move people into accommodation, offering both privacy and safety. The spaces a society provides for people, the spaces a society confines people in, the spaces a society is willing to allow people to live in. These spaces have a story to tell about inequality and about dehumanization, whether in the 19th century or now in the 21st. Hostile environments are still with us and still need to be challenged. Thanks very much.
Leslie. Thanks. Can I ask you all now to mute your microphones once again, just very briefly, while I give the vote of thanks. My name's Anthony Bale. I'm the Executive Dean of the School of Arts, and it's my very great pleasure to give this vote of thanks for this stunning and very moving lecture. Just as it's my great pleasure also to count Professor Leslie Topp as a colleague at Birkbeck, and we've worked together very closely over the last few years. And it's wonderful to see her promotion and the development of her work that she's demonstrated this evening in this lecture. Leslie has given us, I think, a brilliant inaugural lecture, which really showcases her both as a scholar and as a leader in social justice. She's combined an acute presentation of architecture as a study of space and power and powerlessness with an ethical and urgent political concern with asylum and the contingencies of our current moment, and the spatial and ethical ways in which some of the most vulnerable people in our society have been failed and are being failed in an ongoing and structural way. Leslie has also dynamically drawn a range of connections between the present day and the 19th century through the nexus of confinement, isolation, enforced togetherness, and attempts to reform these institutions, charting a continuum of what we now call home and those institutions we regard as prisons, and a kind of cultural ambivalence about sleeping alone and the norms of privacy. I was very struck by the modern divergence of the related terms of asylum as a place of constraint and a kind of cage of imputed safety, etymologically somewhere that's inviolable. That's where asylum comes from. And sanctuary, particularly in terms like sanctuary cities and sanctuary universities that imply a freer association and freer movement, the welcoming of someone into a communal holy space rather than a separating off. So thank you so much, Leslie, for bringing such an incisive and compassionate intelligence and understanding to these issues, and alerting us to the ways in which cultural history leads to new understandings of the very many challenges of our present day. If anybody needs an example of the relevance of studying art history, architectural history, cultural history, then Leslie's lecture brilliantly shows us that. Social justice, Leslie has shown, is an architectural issue, and histories of architecture are also histories of social justice and ethical commitment. So wherever you are in the world, I know there are people all over the place joining us this evening. Thank you for joining us on what's a beautiful summer evening here in London. Before I hand back to Patrizia Di Bello to chair questions and discussion, please unmute briefly to join me in another round of applause for Professor Leslie Topp. Thank you very much.
So thank you. Can I remind people to unmute themselves, mute themselves now, please, to avoid feedback. We have some time to ask Leslie some questions. I'm going to take questions either from the chat or you can raise your hand. It might take me a while to come to every one of you, whichever way you choose, as there is 106 people here tonight. And so to actually just scroll the list of people to check for things might take a while. So I don't know if there is anyone that is already kind of ready to with a question. Right, there is a hand that I'll now. Gilly wants to ask a question. Gilly, come in.
Hello, good evening. Leslie, thank you very much for your lecture, very moving, as has already been said. I'm going to jump right to the end of it and ask you what you think that we as fair-minded individuals could do when we see something like Napier Barracks, which I've been horrified about for some time. I'm the grandchild of refugees, and the attitude of many people to these poor people who, as you say, are labelled illegal when they haven't committed a crime, but have risked their lives to come somewhere to find sanctuary, I find so horrifying every day. I know there's some people in Folkestone who go to the barracks and hand in food and coffee and clean towels and other things, but what can we do? What ideas do you have?
Thanks, Jilly. Thanks very much. I think, above all, write to your MP. And I think there's what's happening there, but that's obviously an issue within a much larger problem, which has to do with how somehow we've let social discourse come to a place where people are stigmatized and dehumanized. And so it becomes somehow acceptable to, at least to the people that have voted in the politicians that are doing this, to house people that way, to treat people that way, and to in the most degrading and dangerous way. I think thank goodness for the High Court, and thank goodness for the legal powers that provide some kind of break on that. But what is it seems that the Home Office hasn't presented clear plans to close those barracks and to put people in a better situation. It's also worth knowing that I think I'm right in this. I know I'm right in this because a Compass student himself has been in this position, that dormitory accommodation is used. Not Napier Barracks isn't alone. There's another set of barracks in Wales, but there are also other dormitory style accommodation being used. It's by the companies to whom asylum seeker accommodation is outsourced. So yeah, educate yourself, write to your MP, political action. Yeah, thank you.
Martina Warner has a question.
Leslie, for a very illuminating and wonderfully insightful talk. I wanted actually to ask you two things. One, I'd quite like you to talk a little bit about what it means that Birkbeck has become a university of sanctuary, what the implications of that are, and that follows from the earlier question, really, what are we doing, what can we do? I know you've done a lot with the Compass project, but then if you don't mind, I want to go through another question on a wider basis, which is, it seems to me that one of the other places that has shrunk into spatial variety are public places of public assembly. And that seems to me to be in symbiosis with the control of people. If there are places for people to go to freely to assemble, then in a way we're also being, sorry, I'm using the word we, which you quite rightly castigated, but that area is also, that scope is also being controlled.
Yeah, thanks, Marina. Just first of all, to fill people in on the University of Sanctuary, Birkbeck applied to become it's to be given the status of University of Sanctuary. There's a very good organization in the UK that asks universities to apply and to kind of meet certain standards and to show a kind of receptiveness and openness and way of enabling forced migrants to participate in higher education across the university in research, and in teaching, and in all aspects of what we do. And wonderfully, the outcome was successful, and Birkbeck was made a University of Sanctuary. But that is certainly the beginning of a process and not the end of a process. And I mean, I won't go into detail about all the different things that we could do, but I think it's a matter really of keeping that role of Birkbeck as a sanctuary in mind across the different things that we do. It's related to how we treat staff as well, who are often, like myself, from other countries. But the hostile environment can kind of permeate universities in the way it deals with staff, with students, and with forced migrant students, of course. So it's to be aware of that and to find ways of institution, but while really being true to this ideal of sanctuary, which has such a great lineage, as Anthony pointed out. And then, yes, of course, spaces of public assembly. That is, in a way, the flip side of what's gone on, isn't it? That it becomes much more difficult to assemble publicly. And I think I've been very impressed and cheered by the fact that people have continued to do so over COVID and found ways of doing that. And I think it's something for my research to think about more how, I've been delving more and more into these interior spaces and the kind of fine-grained detail of how they're divided up. But there is how, what can be said about the wider public space as well that somehow relates to that. So thanks, Marina, for that.
Thanks. We have a lot of questions. There is one on the chat from Len Smith, which says, do you think that one of the issues involved in striking the balance between single rooms and dormitories in asylums was that of desire to stay versus desire to leave? The idea of the asylum was cure and recovery. However, single rooms were relatively comfortable and might discourage people from wanting to move back to less satisfactory circumstances. And this resonates with asylum seekers, is the idea of giving them a hard time. Dormitory might be seen as more of a deterrent and encourage people to want to leave.
Yeah, thanks, Len. That's a really interesting point, and I'd love to discuss that more with you. I should tell people that Len Smith is one of the key scholars in history of psychiatry and the history of asylums, specifically, and someone who's been very generous in assisting me with my work as I've come into the British area, which is his specialism, whereas I was focusing on Central Europe before. And I'm going to keep my ears open for that in the sources, because and try to read between the lines to see if that might be a motivation. That it's a kind of example of a hostile environment, isn't it? As you said, Patrizia, the idea of creating an environment that people don't want to stick around in. Thank you.
Craig, you've had your hand up patiently for a while now. Come in. Craig Gurney.
Yep, so I couldn't find my unmute button. Professor Topp, thank you so much. I really enjoyed that. My name's Craig Gurney from the University of Glasgow, and I'm a housing studies academic. And just to relate to your final points, really, is I just wonder the extent to which you're aware of and would feel like collaborating or moving into some of the current debates within housing studies at the moment in relation to these ideas about building back fairer, thinking about the relationship between the social determinants of health and power and inequality in housing. We've known for 200 years that there's this very close relationship between poor housing and poor health. There is a little bit of international work done around kind of people's responses to lockdown in the last couple of years. There was a study by a couple of Spanish academics looking at access to blue-green space and looking at that in terms of well-being. And there's 4,000 papers a week being published about COVID, so it's going to be difficult to keep up with these. So I just and there's that wider literature about ontological security, which has been really important within particularly British housing studies. Recent work looking at kind of loneliness, isolation, well-being. I can send you some references separately. So I just wondered, have you got any thoughts about that literature and how that might fit into your thinking and this fascinating archive material, and whether it's something that you think in your own work might be worth pursuing in the spirit of kind of joined up collaborative approaches to addressing contemporary problems.
Absolutely. I mean, it sounds. I wrote down ontological security. I don't know about that, and I'm going to look it up. But I've started trying to read around in these areas, and it's something that through my whole research career, I've always wanted to be able to make a connection in a meaningful way between what's going on now and what was going on in the period that I've been talking about. And I've struggled to do that, or I've been probably a bit timid about doing that. But I think that this approach has, and probably COVID really has opened up a channel there. And so it is something I'd very much like to pursue. So maybe, Craig, you and I could email about that separately. That would be fantastic.
Absolutely. Thank you again. Thanks.
Thank you.
Angela has a hand up. Angela, do you want to ask your question?
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk. I must really thank Leslie for his brilliant lecture. It so happened that I'm one of the recipients of the campus project, which has saved me a lot of, in fact, I would have been a dead person if not the campus projects. And then true to her calling of what she presented, she has shown that she's talking for the downtrodden, because many of us that we are in the campus projects, we have given up on the society, that they don't care for anybody. But when we were given this opportunity to study in Birkbeck University, we had a new lease of life. We now try to see the society is not all that the same, that there are some people that are really caring for others that have been forced to leave their hometown to come to United Kingdom. So I'm not really asking any question, but I'm only trying to say, please, if in any form you can intervene, it's very, very essential. Your point is very relevant, no matter how small it is, because as the saying says, that justice will not be served if those people that are not concerned are not outraged. You may not be concerned in any part of this story, but you are rising up to say something we can save so many lives. So no matter how small. So I'm only also adding a voice to her own, that things need to be changed for all human beings, to give every human being a chance to live. Thank you.
Thanks, Angela. Lovely to hear from you. And Angela has been one of the star campus students, I have to say. Just graduated with her MSc in criminology, an expert on immigration detention. So, fantastic work, and a very inspiring rallying cry from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Abby Van Slick, you've had your hand up for a while.
Hi, I'm sorry I don't have a camera going, but it was an absolutely marvelous talk, Leslie. The bringing together of the past and the present was beautifully done. In both contexts, I was wondering a little bit more about children, right? There are ways in which in the past, philanthropists were trying to make a distinction between worthy poor and unworthy poor. And children sometimes were allowed to be considered worthy just because they were not poor. Maybe their parents were at fault, for instance, was the way some of the thinking went. Do you have any insights as to how either children are being treated now, or how they were treated in the 19th century in the work you were doing?
Thanks, Abby. I had children in the back of my mind as I was doing this, or in the back of my mind, as in I was hoping no one would notice that I hadn't mentioned them, because it is different for children, isn't it? I mean, the idea of sharing rooms, as you know in your own work, Abby, the children share rooms up until quite a late stage, and the idea of the single room for the child is only really getting going towards the, I think, only really for the elite, and then getting going towards the end of the 19th century. So there is a slightly different story to be told there. And there's the role, of course, of dormitories in boarding schools, which obviously is not it can be, boarding schools can be for the poor, but normally they're not. So it's worth kind of thinking about what's going on there. And there are all sorts of intricate things, aren't there, in dormitory design in boarding schools that try to preserve some privacy through little cubicles, etc. That's a fascinating topic of discussion in itself. Now, what I need to look at, and I'm sure Len Smith, for instance, could tell us whether the people have done studies of what happened with children in psychiatric settings in the 19th century. I think that they probably were there in many of them, but certainly there was, what's interesting is that you never see them referred to in the kind of the planning treatises and things. You never see spaces set aside for children. And so that's something I'll look at. Thank you.
That's fascinating. Thanks.
There's a question in the chat from Maggie Nurse Iribon. She sends a congratulation, but also asks, I kept thinking about Eastern State in Philadelphia. Remember how they thought that solitary confinement would cure the prisoner of their ills, but in fact made them all insane. I also think of all the people who had major family issues to foresee them during the pandemic because they had no privacy. Clearly, space is directly related to mental health or lack of.
Yeah, so thanks, Maggie, and lovely to hear from you. So Maggie's an old friend from my days in Philadelphia when I was a grad student at Bryn Mawr. And Eastern State Penitentiary is this really important historic prison in Philadelphia that's still open as a museum. I really recommend people go and see it if you're ever in Philadelphia. And it was kind of pioneer of the solitary system. Yeah, I mean, that link between space and mental health is, again, one of those things that's been kind of in the background, unarticulated in my talk. And it's another of those things that I'm slightly timid about getting into, but something that I need to break through into, because there is, as Craig was saying, there are lots of studies about the links between space and housing and environments and mental health or mental illness. And it's, as a historian, because the definitions of mental health have changed so much over time, it becomes a really tricky area of how to make kind of solid and valid statements about that over the course of time. But I think I do want to pursue it further, and I'm going to try to do that. So thanks, Maggie.
Leslie, Dinesh Mendes sends congratulations, and then I think Len Smith wants to come in.
Yes, Leslie, congratulations on your elevation to professor. You asked if I could comment about the issue of children in asylums in the 19th century. I mean, certainly there has been some work on children in asylums, primarily on children with what we now call learning disabilities, but not solely. There is a fairly recent book by Stephen Taylor about children in asylums, and of course there has also been work by people like David Wright. His book on the Earlswood Asylum dealt quite a lot with children. Mm-hmm. So that's just in response to what you're asking.
Thank you. Thanks.
And there is a question in the chat from Swati Chattopadhyay. Hi, Leslie. First, congratulations. Second, could you speak about the racialization of these spaces?
Hi, Shati. Nice to see you. I'm glad you could come along. Shati is a big influence on me and a really important architectural historian who was a visiting professor at Birkbeck for a time in the Architecture, Space and Society Center, and who has done absolutely groundbreaking, important work on racialization of spaces in the context, especially of colonial India. So I think to talk about the racialization of certainly of asylum spaces. Mainly that has been done by people who've been writing about colonial asylums. And I think that will need to be a chapter of what I'm looking at. And in fact, Len is another person that he could come in probably with the answer to this as well. What I would be very curious to see is where the issue of dormitories and single rooms comes down in asylums built right in the same period in the colonies. Len, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, I could do. As you say, I mean, there's been quite a lot of work on colonial asylums. I did a book on asylums in the British Caribbean, but there's been quite a lot of work on asylums in the Indian subcontinent, and also, of course, in Southern Africa. And most of those studies do include looking at the issues of race and race segregation or non-segregation within asylums. I mean, it's quite a varied picture, actually. Some colonies where you'd expect a lot of racial separation, there wasn't necessarily, but in other places there was. But it was an important issue. Single rooms, I'm not so sure. I think you tend to find in colonial asylums that single rooms were more for seclusion of people who presenting difficult behaviour, like you're describing in relation to English asylums later in the 19th century. Single rooms for the purposes of comfort and privacy, you don't find so much of that in colonial asylums.
And Shati, that would relate, of course, to the points you've always made about the very porous nature of spaces in colonial structures. The way that there is an interpenetration of spaces, perhaps more than in British architecture.
I think that is the case. However, I mean, I'm increasingly thinking that we have left out Britain and the metropolitan regions, whether it's France, Britain, out of this discussion about racialization. We always think about the colonies. That's where we still look at race. I think that needs to change.
Yeah.
Because a whole generation of scholars have taught us that it's not only happening there. The color, empire doesn't happen just there. Empire happens at home, and that needs to be taken seriously in architectural history. That's what I'm thinking about. I think this is. I know Mark's here, Mark Princeton. Mark may be able to speak to that more, but that's something that has been on my mind. I think it is a big neglected area. I think we need to learn how to read race in those spaces. We haven't quite done that. I mean, in the US context, it has been done, but even there, there's not enough interpenetration of what's happening in, let's say, Caribbean or in other parts of the colonial world, or even Australia, and thinking about, what's happening in Britain and the US. I think there's a real sort of a lost opportunity.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that's very exciting, actually, to think about it that way.
Mark, Vincent, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Leslie. I mean, it's great to be reminded of how important the discipline that we both share should be. But I'm not sure if I can come in on Swati's point, although I did want to make two glancing points. One is about porosity, which is that perhaps we can and should talk about porosity more in the British situation if we focus more upon those asylums and prisons which were conglomerations built over different kind of building campaigns rather than the ones which are more kind of model buildings. Second, the second point I wanted to make in passing is that I'm not so happy with the word sanctuary generally. I mean, that's because of its religious connections. I mean, I think we should bring in the term solidarity here, and especially solidarity in regard to the ways in which people might resist entry into the asylum, the prison, because of what they lose, even though their conditions may be extremely bad in terms of the environmental condition. But the actual point I wanted to make was actually the question I wanted to ask was actually very specifically about Connolly. And that is, Connolly clearly has a sense of environmental determinism in the way he describes the rooms that he effectively wants to create. You know, because he talks about how they calm and they quiet, and there's a sense of order, regularity, because of what they, in a sense, what they clear out or leave out. And so that implies that he has an environmentally determinist theory of insanity being caused by these spatial, different spatial conditions. But it also implies, does it not, that he should have a theory about rehabilitation in spaces beyond the asylum that is also environmentally determinist.
Yeah, it does imply that. I don't think that he articulates that theory anywhere, but I need to read more widely in what he's written. And I think that there's a lot of kind of self-contradiction that goes on in a lot of these psychiatric texts. There is especially as architectural historians, we are attuned to those moments of environmental determinism, as you say, that idea that it's the spaces that are doing the healing. And yet you really have to see that alongside a kind of, I guess, pragmatism about, you know, are there any ways in which you can point to that in fact happening? It's also, of course, tied up in the idea that they had very little else to work with in terms of treatments and therapies, and almost nothing in the way of drugs or anything along those lines. So, yeah, I mean, Connolly is a fascinating figure for me, especially because he has this social dimension to what he's doing that I haven't seen quite expressed in that way in among other psychiatric writers.
Claire Zimmerman has a question.
Hi, Leslie. Thanks so much. That was wonderful. I'm trying to frame a proper question for you. And the general tenor of the question is, where's the line between legal standards for spatial design in the material that you're looking at, or in the present? I'm partly inspired by the work of Sarah Schindler, who's a legal scholar, who writes about concepts like architectural exclusion, where she's actually working in the present and trying to find ways to basically litigate rights through space, through spatial design, basically. So when a space is designed to exclude certain kinds of people, can you then act in a legal framework against that manner of design? And I'm just wondering, you know, at a certain point in time, it became illegal to have sleeping rooms without a window, for example. And I haven't pursued this line of argument very far, but I'm just curious as to where you found the line between legally sanctioned spaces and things that were clearly illegal to do for incarcerated peoples.
You know, I haven't looked at that particular issue of legality, but there certainly are a lot of discussion of regulations and the kind of standards that should be expected. I just don't know, so I don't want to say that those could be legally enforced. But they tended to concentrate especially on things like cubic volume of air, and this, you know, which was seen as so important in terms of the communication of infectious diseases, you know, topically now. And that kind of argument would fall down often in favor of dormitories, because you could generate much more cubic volume of air with higher ceilings and, you know, more windows and better ventilation generally. So there was a kind of technical quality to that there was no space there for issues of privacy and time apart and that kind of thing. But I'll look up the work of Schindler. That sounds really, really interesting. And the idea of architectural exclusion. And I wonder whether there's something to be said too about the architectural or spatial treatment of certain groups, you know, the idea that you know, that you might be providing something for people, but what you're providing, you know, undermines people's rights to a kind of full existence. Yeah, thanks, Claire.
It sort of goes to the limit of Mark's question in a way, in that this would take environmental determinism to, you know, to sort of the limit condition of determining legal rights or legality through some conclusion about how space affects human behavior or the human psyche. And, you know, that's a difficult, that's sort of a difficult line to follow. When you think about ventilation, then you're talking about a clear health issue. It's much more tricky when you're talking about mental health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right, Leslie, this is definitely has been very thought-provoking. You've had a lot of congratulations. I haven't attempted to read in the chats, and maybe there is just, can you bear to take one last question from Eleanor Shapiro? Who says,
yes.
Congratulations.
One last question would be great.
Also asks about were there gendered spaces where women imagine differently than men through the spaces?
No, that's a really good question, Ilana, and hello, I'm glad that you're able to join. What's really kind of intriguing about asylum spaces is the way that women and men are almost always given absolutely identical spaces, at least in floor plan. So there is this symmetry in the design of the asylum that is just a constant feature of asylum design, where you have a central axis, men are housed on one side, women on the other, and there's only minute differences, if any differences at all, architecturally in what happens on each side. So there's a kind of, it's almost like an unsexing of people, where you divide people apart. The idea, of course, is to avoid any mixing of the sexes, but then you also kind of create imagine them as mirror images of each other in terms of the spaces they live in, which runs really counter to the 19th century discourse that we're all used to about gendered spaces and women's sphere and men's spaces and so on. So it's a really interesting point that's worth examining further, I would say.